Hi, everyone. Valerie Williams here from Converge Firm, here with our next podcast episode. I'm so excited to talk about this topic. It's such a critical part of DEI efforts. Okay, today we're going to talk about DEI goal setting, accountability, metrics, KPIs, OKRs, all of the things. It's such a critical part to DEI efforts for you to really think through goal setting. I mean, if you're not tracking your programs and your progress, are you really actually doing DEI? I think not. Okay. So today I have 7 tips on how to approach goal setting for DEI within your organization. Let's jump right in. Okay. Tip number 1, no surprise here. We talk about this a lot, is always starting with the why. What does that mean? What do we mean by starting with the why? Anytime you're thinking strategically about DEI, you want to revisit your why for this work. We have a whole workshop to help leadership teams really think through this why for their organization. And it's all about getting really clear on a vision for this work. Having a clear vision for DEI helps with goal setting. It allows you to establish clear guidelines and to get more specific around what success looks like in this area. So our first tip always is to start with the why, revisit your why for the organization, making sure that why is always connected to your overall business priorities so that the work of DEI is not relegated in a corner. It's really woven into the fabric of your organization. Okay, so start with the why. That allows you to get really, really clear on that vision for your work. And that vision helps you establish top line goals for your organization. Okay. All right. Tip number 2 is, I almost started with this as tip number 1 because it's such a common practice that we see out in the market around DEI goal setting. Tip number 2 is don't just set representation goals. We see often that people immediately jump to hiring goals or targets, or even sometimes quotas when it comes to DEI goal setting. We definitely want you to have some metrics and some accountability around representation within your organization, but DEI is such a large space. We want to make sure that we're thinking holistically around goal setting for DEI. Okay. The additional thing about representation goal setting is that really just covers the D in DEI, that diversity piece. How are you holding yourself accountable to equity within your organization? How are you holding yourselves accountable to improvements of inclusion and to having an inclusive workplace? Okay. We want to make sure that we have goals across the board when it comes to the D, the E, and the I, not just this representation. It can be very tempting to set a percentage change, for example, around a particular community within your organization. Maybe you're trying to hire more women in leadership, and maybe you're trying to go after more people of color and have more of that representation within your organization. And again, those are noble goals, but we want to remember that percentages aren't people. Okay, so we want to make sure that the experience within your workplace is also being considered within your goal setting. Okay, as it relates to equity type goals, just to give you a couple of some examples here, it may be that you're holding yourself accountable to a pay equity audit to make sure that you're paying people equitably, as an example. For inclusion, one example of a goal is really looking at putting in place an inclusion survey. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but really looking at how are we improving inclusion year over year. A good way to think about that is to have a survey, check in on sentiment with your organization, roll out your plan, try some tactics out, and then survey your population again. And you want to see some year over year improvement over some of those inclusion questions that you're going to ask. Okay. So again, tip number 2 is about don't just set representation goals that just covers your D and your DE&I. Really think about how are you holding yourself accountable outside of hiring, outside of representation. Okay. All right. Let's jump to tip number 3. Tip number 3 is really about relying on an established goal setting system or structure or framework for your goal setting. We work with a lot of tech startups who are operating on a KPI or an OKR goal setting system. We love those systems. It's really, for those, OKR stands for objective key results. KPI is around your key performance indicator. Your OKR is really about getting clear on your objectives, what problems you're trying to solve, right? And then really having a key result to know if you actually met those objectives. Whether your key performance indicator, that KPI that I mentioned, is getting clear on what metric is going to show progress in the area that you're trying to have some impact in, that you're trying to see some change in. Okay. Relying on an established goal setting system, again, reinforces that this is a business priority. We're setting goals around DEI, just like we set goals around product development, around product launches. We want to be that strategic when it comes to DEI. So be sure that you're relying on a goal setting system. Use the framework that your company is using to set goals around other areas within your organization. That's a good place to start. All right, tip number 4 is consider the stage that you're in when setting your DEI goals. Okay, we talked a little bit about this on a previous podcast around your DEI strategy is going to take on different forms at different stages of your journey. Okay, we'll remind you of our stages. At Converge, we look at a foundational phase of setting a DEI strategy. We then go to a scaling phase or stage, and then we go to a mature stage or phase. At your foundational level, your goal setting is really going to be a lot of outcomes based and really about establishing a clear foundation for DEI at your organization. Your goals at this point might be launching something or tracking something for the first time. Maybe you're tracking promotions by demographic for the first time. Maybe you are launching a committee. Those are very noteworthy goals that should be included in a foundational goal setting process. Whereas when you move to a scaling stage or phase of your strategy, this is where you might bring in that inclusion survey that I mentioned before and really measure sentiment change year over year, maybe quarter over quarter, using those survey metrics or pulse surveys that you might have in place, right? The mature phase, we may add some additional goals around thinking about customer acquisition or thinking about supplier diversity and supplier spend, of how much money you're spending towards contracts for different groups within businesses. But those are more mature goal setting frameworks and tactics rather than thinking about these other elements. So again, think about the DEI journey that you're on. Think about the stage that you're in and really set stage appropriate goals for your journey. Okay. That was tip number 4. Tip number 5 is about setting your goals before you launch your DEI activities. Okay. This may seem kind of a no-brainer here, but it's often something that we see in DEI efforts that you want to have a bias towards action. So you want to jump in, right? And you want to launch something, but we want to make sure that we're getting clear on our objectives, clear on the problems that we're trying to solve so that our goals are clear and so that people know why we're doing what we're doing. Okay. So just a quick tip there. We see this quite often. Make sure you're setting your goals before you launch your activity so that we can, again, tie all of this work together. Tip number 6 is about starting with a short list of goals. We don't want to do too much, right? We want to set our journey up for success. And so if you're holding yourself accountable to 5, 6, 7, 8 goals, that can be daunting for you to try to track progress and to try to really implement change within your organization. So we recommend a short list of goals. Maybe you start with 2 to 3 goals, maybe 2 to 4 goals starting out. Instead of thinking of a long list, as you advance in your journey, you can always add additional goals to your list and additional ways to hold yourself accountable. But again, don't shoot yourself in the foot. Start with a short list of goals. All right, the final tip, the 7th tip that I have is getting feedback from and collaborating with employees in this process. Okay, no surprise here. Big design principle for us at Converge is to involve employees as much as possible in this process. And so what we want to do is to get feedback from employees on those goals. If we've surveyed employees and we have a short list, can we put those goals in front of employees to get their feedback early on in the process? And when you're done with your short list of goals and you have a draft, put those in front of your employees again. Make sure that you heard them correctly. Make sure that those goals resonate with them, that they will feel proud of your organization if you reach those goals. Really get that feedback going with employees as well. Okay, so those are our general tips on setting goals around DEI for your organization. Again, 7 steps. Let me recap those for you. Our 7 tips. First, start with your why. Revisit your why. Revisit it often. Be clear on why you're doing DEI efforts in the first place. That will help us on that goal setting journey that we're on here. 2, don't just set representation goals. We want to think beyond that D. Think about goal setting for equity and inclusion and belonging or accessibility, whatever components you have in your DEI strategy. You want to make sure you're building goals and setting yourself up for an accountability structure around all of those focus areas. Okay. Tip number 3, rely on an established goal setting system. How does your company set goals internally? Use that goal setting system. Step 4, consider the stage that you're on and the journey that you're on, where you are, where your organization is in your DEI journey while setting goals. Set stage appropriate goals. Tip number 5 is to set your goals before you launch your initiatives, right? We want to tie those initiatives to the goals that you have in progress or in process. Tip number 6 is to start with a short list of goals. Don't hold yourself accountable to too much. 2 to 4 is a good place to start. And finally, get feedback and involve your employees in that goal setting process. Okay. So hopefully this is helpful. I really hope that these tips will help as you plan for 2022. We're in goal planning season right now. If you want to stay in touch with us and to learn more about really good tips that we have around goal setting, subscribe to our podcast for YouTube. Check us out on Instagram as well, Converge Firm, as well as convergefirm.com. If you need some specific help with how to set goals for your organization, we're here to help and help you guide through that process. All right. See you all later. Thank you.